Have you ever imagined what it would be like to win Wimbledon, the most traditional and coveted tournament in world tennis, with only 17 years old? We are not talking about a promise, nor a movie script. This was the real life of Boris Becker, a young red-haired German with a face still like a teenager, who went from being virtually anonymous to becoming part of the history of the sport in a matter of days. But what seemed like the beginning of a fairy tale would end up becoming one of the most shocking and exciting stories in modern tennis. In 1985, the world watched in amazement as a fearless boy dove into the sacred courts of Wimbledon, unleashing aggressive shots, improbable volleys, and most of all, displaying a confidence that seemed unattainable for someone so young. Becker was not the favorite. In fact, few knew who he was before that epic campaign. But, point by point, he left behind big names on the circuit and broke not only rackets, but also all the expectations of critics and tennis fans. When he lifted the trophy that English summer, Boris Becker not only became the youngest champion in Wimbledon history, he inaugurated a new era in the sport. You might be wondering, how did someone so young manage to withstand the pressure, the media attention, and the responsibility of carrying an entire country on his shoulders? The answer is more complex than it seems. Because behind the shy smile and the powerful arm, there was a boy trying to figure out his place in the world. Becker didn't have time to mature little by little. He was suddenly thrown on top of the world, like a true real-time tennis legend. The impact was immediate. Germany, still searching for a great hero in international sport, adopted him as its national symbol. The press put him on the covers of magazines, sponsors came knocking on his door, and the tennis world bowed before his talent. He was called Phenomenon, Golden Boy, the new king of the grass. And rightly so. His combination of brute strength, agility, and courage was rare, and made him a household name, one of the most popular athletes on the planet before even turning 20. But as cameras followed him in every direction, and the courts felt like his second home, Becker began to deal with a silent enemy, crushing pressure of early fame. After all, how does someone so young deal with the responsibility of staying on top? What is it like to wake up every day with the weight of not disappointing millions of fans, coaches, sponsors, and even family members? If you've ever felt like you needed to be perfect even without knowing exactly how, maybe you can imagine a little of what Boris was going through. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and even move you. Boris Becker's story goes far beyond trophies and sports headlines. It's about talent, yes, but also about loneliness, impulsive decisions, and the consequences of living in the spotlight for too long. It's a journey of glory and pain, of meteoric rise and brutal fall. And if you think you know everything about this tennis legend, chances are you haven't seen the most human and most tragic inside of this story. In the next chapter, we delve into the height of Becker's career, the legendary titles, the millions earned, and the first signs that, behind the image of the unbeatable champion, something was already beginning to crack. While Boris Becker was collecting trophies, accumulating Grand Slam titles, and establishing his position among the giants of tennis, something less visible was also beginning to grow. The internal pressure, the silent doubts, and the loneliness of someone who, at such a young age, already seemed to have conquered everything, but was still trying to understand who he really was off the court. The applause was loud, the million-dollar contracts were piling up, but it's not always easy to be a hero when the world expects you to never fail. And perhaps this is a part of the story that few people stop to truly feel. If this topic resonates with you, if this story has somehow touched you or reminded you of something similar, even if on a different scale, leave a comment below with what has left the biggest impression on you so far. It could be a memory, an opinion, or just a feeling that has come to mind. Your voice here really matters. It's this kind of exchange that turns a video into a conversation and a story, into a community. And of course, if you've made it this far, it's because this content speaks to you. So take the opportunity to enjoy the video. It really helps to bring this story to more people who also love tennis and are interested in these intense and real stories. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is a great time. That way you can continue following this series and other exciting stories of great names in the sport. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content that goes beyond statistics and gets to the heart of the game. But back to Boris Becker's career. At the height of his fame, while he seemed unbeatable on the court, the first signs of wear and tear were already beginning to appear behind the scenes. His meteoric success, which in the eyes of many was a dream come true, was taking a heavy toll. And what would come next? Few could have predicted. Boris Becker didn't just win Wimbledon at the age of 17. He began a reign that would forever change the way tennis was viewed, not just in Germany but around the world. The explosion of talent that wowed the public in 1985 was not an isolated incident. Becker would win Wimbledon again the following year, cementing his status as a true titan of the court. He was aggressive, bold, and intense. His manner on the court was almost theatrical, diving, spectacular volleys, and extreme racket swings. It was impossible to look away. During that period, the men's circuit was undergoing an intense transformation. The generation of McEnroe, Connors, and Lendl still dictated the rules, but a new style was emerging, more physical, more direct. And at the center of it all was Boris, with his stage presence, his powerful serve, and his relentless determination. He wasn't just another good player, he was a show in himself, and with that came the titles, more than 60 throughout his career, the epic finals, the memorable clashes with greats like Stefan Edberg, Andre Agassi, and Pete Sampras. The rivalry with Edberg in particular became one of the most emblematic of the era, representing the duel between two completely different playing philosophies, strategic coldness versus explosive intensity. Boris Becker became a brand, a symbol, a reference. In the 1980s and 1990s, it was impossible to talk about tennis without mentioning his name. He was everywhere, on the courts, in magazines, in commercials. And the more he won, the more his image grew. The red-haired boy from Lyman had become a global idol. For Germany, he was not just a champion, he was the pride of the nation. And that said a lot about the context of the time. Germany was looking for symbols of excellence, figures who could unite a people. In the process of rebuilding their culture and identity, Boris was that hero. With fame came privileges, private jets, luxurious parties, magazine covers alongside movie stars, invitations to the most closed circles of the European elite. At a young age, he already had more than anyone could ever imagine, achieving in a lifetime. But the more Becker shone in the spotlight, the further he seemed from the simplicity that shaped him. It was as if, little by little, he stopped being a player and became a character, a construct that needed to be sustained, even when the cameras were off. It is important to remember that Boris Becker's peak occurred in an era when technology had not yet shaped the image of athletes as it does today. There were no social networks, instant editing, or filters. What he did on the court was seen live, in real time, with all the flaws, mistakes, and brilliance. This made his performance even more impressive, because he had nowhere to hide, and yet he exposed himself, and won. Behind all this success, however, there was a pressure that didn't make it into the newspapers. The constant expectation of maintaining excellence, of always winning, of being the icon that people expected to see. Few people wonder what happens to a human being who is placed on a pedestal so early and who starts to be expected to be perfect, as if he weren't made up of the same doubts, fears, and limitations as anyone else. The truth is that extreme success can also be a burden, and with Becker, this became increasingly visible, albeit silently. He began to feel the weight of the decisions he had been making. Coaching changes, team changes, complex negotiations. With sponsors, emotional strain on relationships. Life off the court was as demanding as the 5 sets of a final, and in this invisible game, the most talented player doesn't always win. Tennis is a solitary sport by nature. Even surrounded by coaches, physiotherapists, and agents, the player enters the court alone. And for someone who has lived in the spotlight since such a young age, internal loneliness has become a constant adversary. The media, which had previously idolized him, began to look for his weaknesses. Every misplaced gesture, every personal slip-up was turned into a headline. He was no longer just a prodigy, he was a man under judgment. Becker began to live between the glare of glory and the shadows behind the scenes. He was still a champion, still lifting trophies, but something in his demeanor was beginning to change. A weariness that came not only from the body, but from the soul. Because staying on top is not just a question of skill. It is a daily battle of mentality, resilience, and emotional balance. And that is precisely where the hidden truth behind many brilliant careers lies. Visible success, the kind that we applaud, often hides a silent struggle. It is the battle against self-sabotage, against the fear of falling, against the feeling that perhaps you are living something that you did not completely choose. Boris Becker defeated countless opponents on the court. But the most difficult opponent was within himself. The weight of sustaining a personal empire before even understanding what he wanted from his own life. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is in this silent turnaround, still during the peak, that the signs begin to appear. Small details, seemingly harmless decisions, but which, in retrospect, reveal the beginning of a fall that no one imagined. Comment here. That makes sense to me, if any part of this journey has touched you in any way. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because behind the image of the unbeatable, charismatic, and winning athlete, there was a story that few saw clearly, and that little by little began to reveal itself. The truth is that the price of success rarely appears on the scoreboard. It is not broadcast on television, it is not in the statistics or in the shiny trophies. It hides behind the scenes, where smiles are forced, silences are heavy, and the pressure becomes almost unbearable. Boris Becker was at the height of his career. He was a millionaire, revered, globally famous, and had a life that, at first glance, seemed perfect. But inside, the emotional strain was growing. The demands of the circuit, the business commitments, the exhausting training, the constant traveling, and above all, the demand for perfection. All of this began to erode his mental balance. The golden boy of tennis had become a man haunted by a shadow that grew with him, that of his own expectations. In the eyes of the public, he was still a legend, but behind the scenes, Becker was starting to fall apart. His mental health, long ignored in high-performance sports, was already showing warning signs. At first, it was physical fatigue that wouldn't go away, then insomnia, anxiety, and difficulty concentrating. Little by little, this affected his performance on the court, his personal decisions, and the way he related to the people around him. He began to alternate between moments of euphoria and periods of profound exhaustion, emotional, psychological, and even existential. The pressure to maintain his champion image also affected his private life. His relationships were frequently exposed by the media, turned into a spectacle, analyzed and judged by people who never really knew him. Becker got married, had children, and went through messy separations. Some of these situations ended up being featured in tabloids with invasive details, which only increased his feeling of exhaustion and vulnerability. And when the mind is fragile, decisions become more dangerous. It was in this context that he began to get involved in more serious problems. Mismanaged businesses, high-risk investments, trusting the wrong people. The money that seemed inexhaustible began to evaporate, and with it came the first headlines that caused surprise. Boris Becker being sued. Boris Becker owing millions. Boris Becker providing explanations to the courts. Up until that point, the world still saw him as an idol going through a rough patch. But the narrative was starting to change. He was no longer just a former champion facing a bad streak. He was a symbol of success approaching the abyss. And that's something the public often doesn't know how to process. Because when someone is placed on such a high pedestal, any slip-up feels like a dramatic fall. And Becker was no different. Debts began to pile up at a rapid pace. Luxurious homes were mortgaged, luxury cars were sold, and accounts were frozen. He tried to maintain his poise, to keep smiling at events, to commentate on tennis matches on TV, to make public appearances. But the reality off camera was different. A tangle of lawsuits, court decisions, and financial pressures that became increasingly suffocating. In 2017, he was officially declared bankrupt by the British courts, accused of owing millions of dollars to several creditors. The image of a sports icon now shared space with that of a man in ruins. And the most devastating thing is that Becker wasn't a villain in this story. He was a living reflection of what happens when success isn't supported by a solid emotional foundation. He wasn't just financially broke. He was emotionally fragile, trying to deal with a series of choices that, when combined, put him in a situation of extreme vulnerability. And this is a part of the journey that needs to be told, because it reveals something that goes beyond tennis. It lays bare the hidden truth about the backstage of fame and the devastating impact that ill-advised decisions, coupled with the neglect of one's own mental health, can have. Becker was no longer just a big name in sports. He had become a living example that glory has a dark side. And that side is often ignored until it is too late. The media, which had once celebrated him, now exploited his personal defeats as entertainment. But behind every headline was a human being dealing with shame, regret, and fear of tomorrow. The man who had enchanted the world with his courage on the court was now facing the greatest adversary in life, himself. This internal transformation was perhaps the most profound he experienced. Because while fame publicly elevated him, flaws and vulnerabilities silently dragged him down. And there is a very specific pain in realizing that what was once a source of pride, the brilliance, the titles, the name, was now also a burden that the world relentlessly exacted. The former champion couldn't just disappear. He was constantly reminded of who he was, and this daily comparison between the glorious past and the turbulent present only increased the suffering. In the midst of all this, he still tried to maintain some control. He made public appearances with a calm air, gave interviews trying to explain the inexplicable, and smiled whenever possible. But his eyes no longer had the same sparkle. His posture was no longer that of someone who dominated the world. It was that of someone trying to stand up to it. Few people realize, but there is a huge difference between falling because of weakness and falling because of excess weight. Becker did not fall because he was fragile. He fell because he was carrying more than any human being should. Write it down. I'm on this journey too, if this part of the story touched you in any way. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happened next in Boris Becker's career is both unbelievable and brutally real. There's something unsettling about watching a global idol, someone who seemed to have it all, walk a path that leads straight to collapse. And we're not talking about just a symbolic fall or a melancholic retirement like so many others the sport has seen. We're talking about a concrete, public, and irreversible fall. The tennis legend who enchanted the world with his bravery on the court was now facing a court, and not as a commentator or a tribute. He was a defendant. After his official bankruptcy filing in 2017, Boris Becker's troubles did not diminish. In fact, they intensified. The investigation into his assets and debts revealed a web of omissions, suspicious transfers, and documents that raised serious questions about his conduct. British authorities opened a case investigating whether Becker had deliberately hidden valuable assets to avoid paying creditors. And here the story reaches a point that few could have foreseen. The idol was now being accused of fraudulent bankruptcy. It's a shock, and rightly so. How did someone who was once a millionaire, a Wimbledon champion, the face of global campaigns, an absolute icon of the sport, end up behind bars? That question echoed everywhere as the news began to spread. The man who had so often lifted trophies in front of crowds was on trial for trying to hide millions in accounts and properties, while declaring himself unable to pay debts. And it wasn't just a frivolous accusation. It was an accusation based on evidence, bank statements, traced financial transactions, hidden properties, valuable undeclared jewelry. During the trial, details that seemed to have come out of a dark script came to light. Becker had allegedly transferred significant sums of money to accounts belonging to family members and business partners shortly after declaring bankruptcy. He had allegedly failed to disclose ownership of high-value real estate, stocks, image, rights, and even historic trophies, including, according to investigators, the 1985 Wimbledon trophy itself. That's right, the ultimate symbol of his sporting consecration, used as a bargaining chip in a lawsuit, a gesture that, for many, symbolized the bottom of a once brilliant career. The allegations were serious, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, and Becker's image, which had been a hero for years, was now taking on tragic overtones. Newspapers splashed his photo with heavy headlines. Acidic comments spread across social media. And once again, the trial was not just a legal one. It was a social one. It was a moral one. It was as if the entire world was reevaluating who he really was, not the player, but the man behind the myth. In April 2022, the verdict was announced. Boris Becker was found guilty on 4 of the 24 charges he faced. The sentence came soon after 2.5 years in prison, half of which was mandatory in a closed regime. It was official. The former Wimbledon champion was now an inmate of the British prison system. And this image, as absurd as it may seem, became real. Becker, in prison uniform, head down, being taken into custody after the trial. This isn't just a scandal. It's a symbol of the profound disconnect between external success and internal balance. Because this story isn't about bank account numbers or lost trophies. It's about the choices we make when we're feeling fragile. It's about the risk of building an entire identity on performance, on image, on the need to maintain a semblance of control, even when everything inside us is falling apart. Becker's arrest represents more than the financial collapse of a former athlete. It represents the emotional collapse of someone who, at some point, stopped asking for help, who tried to solve everything alone, who believed that he could avoid the damage with more effort, more cunning, more silence. And that says a lot about what happens when we don't treat wounds while they are still small. The saddest thing is realizing that this is not a story of villainy. It's a story of humanity. Becker was not a monster. He was a brilliant, courageous, talented man, but deeply vulnerable to the traps of fame, greed, and the illusion of invincibility. He was wrong, yes, and he paid for it. But before you judge, perhaps it's worth looking at the journey that got him there. Because the truth is that no champion is born ready to deal with the fall, and often those who fall the deepest are exactly those who once flew the highest. While serving his sentence in Wandsworth, one of the most notorious and harshest prisons in the United Kingdom, Boris Becker had time to reflect, away from the cameras, the interviews, and the courts. Isolated from the world that once made him the best. There, he was no longer the national hero, nor the child prodigy. He was just another man trying to survive the consequences of his own actions. And this kind of silence often reveals truths that the noise of fame hides. Write it down. I understand the weight of choices if you feel like this part of Becker's journey made you think deeper. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because Boris Becker's story, despite having gone through the most glorious highs and the most bitter lows, does not end with his downfall. It is not, and never has been, just a story about failure. It is, in essence, a story about what happens when a human being tries to find meaning again after the world he built falls apart. About how personal transformation, however painful, can begin exactly at the place where everything seems lost. After his conviction and the start of his sentence, many people believed that this would be the end of Becker's legacy. That prison would be the end point of a journey that began with brilliance and ended in shame. But what few realized is that, in that forced silence, far from the flashes and headlines, something began to change inside him. The time he spent incarcerated served not only as a legal punishment, but as an inevitable break to face his own choices head-on. And that's where the narrative changes tone. Because while some people get lost forever, others manage to use pain as a starting point for a new mindset. Upon leaving prison, Boris did not return as the hero he once was, nor as the symbol of the fall. He came back a more aware man, not necessarily calmer, nor less human, but with a different kind of clarity. He himself began to recognize his mistakes more honestly, assuming responsibilities that he might have previously tried to justify. In recent interviews, he speaks more calmly, more carefully with his words. He no longer has that automatic idle stance. What we see now is someone who, for the first time in a long time, seems to be truly present, living his own journey, without the burden of representing something other than himself. This change does not erase what happened. The failures, the damage, the losses are still part of the story. But that is precisely the beauty of reconstruction. It does not require perfection. It requires presence. And Boris, despite everything, is trying to start over. With smaller steps, with humility, and, most importantly, with the awareness that talent is not enough to sustain an entire life. It is necessary to learn to take care of what is off the court as well: relationships, emotional health, mind, finances, time, and one's own identity, in addition to success. And perhaps that is one of the most profound lessons this story can offer. Because for a long time, Becker believed, like so many of us, that what he did defined who he was. That the next title, the next contract, the next recognition would be enough to fill the void within. But the hidden truth is that no external achievement has the power to heal what is disorganized within. And when that balance is not there, success can become a greater risk than failure. In Becker's case, this truth was exposed in a public and painful way. But that's precisely why his story has such an impact. Because it shows that even giants stumble. Even heroes can get lost. And that doesn't diminish what they did. It just reinforces the fact that, at the end of the day, they are human, like the rest of us, with fears, doubts, needs, impulses. The difference is that some had to deal with this in front of an entire planet watching. There is something courageous about getting back up after such a brutal fall. It is not easy to face one's mistakes, admit failures, apologize, and start over without the certainty that the public will understand. And yet, Boris is trying. He has participated in educational projects, addressed the media with a more restrained stance, and even explored new professional possibilities off the court. It is not about cleaning up one's image, but about rebuilding it based on the truth. Ultimately, what Becker shows us is that talent does open doors, but it is the decisions made outside the spotlight that define the strength of a life. Physical training is important, but emotional training is what sustains the journey. And when we ignore this part, even the greatest can fall. Boris Becker's story is not just about tennis, it's about choices, it's about identity, it's about the price of fame and the importance of introspection. But most of all, it's about the power of recognizing that there's always time to learn. Even after you make mistakes, even after losing everything. Because sometimes the real victory is not in winning another tournament, but in being able to look in the mirror and say, I messed up, but I'm still here, and I'm going to do it differently. Comment here. That makes sense to me, if this piece of history provoked any reflection in you. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way, and honestly, that says a lot. Not everyone is willing to take a deep look at trajectories like Boris Becker's, which show not only the brilliance of achievements, but also the shadows that come along with them. If this content made sense to you, if it provoked some reflection, or brought some truth that you needed to hear, leave your comment below with the phrase, "This message was for me." It will be good to know that we shared this journey until the end. Please also leave a like, not only because it helps the video, but because it shows that it's worth continuing to bring stories like this. Real, human, that go beyond numbers and trophies. And if you want to continue exploring these narratives in more depth, subscribe to the channel. Here we don't just talk about tennis, we talk about lives that the sport has helped shape. There is a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The conversation is not over yet.